Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Carlin, and I'm here today with Dr. Katherine MacLean. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
So good to see you.
You too.
So we were talking before I pressed record, and I was like, wait, I want to get all this in the interview. So we're going to be talking about some pretty hot topics today: birth, death, psychedelics, and your work, your memoir. You've been a writer and a researcher. You have your PhD, you're a scientist, a mother, and you were just letting me know that you were one of the first researchers at Johns Hopkins in 2009. And for the past 2 decades, you've been studying the effects of mindfulness and surviving motherhood. We were talking about how do we survive motherhood and learning a lot about death and grief. You're really diving into the major topics of life and death.
That's it. For better or for worse, I have gotten a chance to experience the full range of the cycles of life and death in the last 10 years. So I think I'm a bit of a amateur expert in these topics. I've seen a lot of death up close in family and friends. I've birthed
Mm.
2 children. And the motherhood piece, the part that happens in the middle, is the part that I'm still trying to figure out.
How old are your children?
They're 9 and 6.
Let's just go back a little bit. Let's travel backwards. We'll do a little time travel here, too. When did your exploration and curiosity about death come?
I was thinking about this. I was a bit of a weird kid. The earliest memory I have of being fascinated by death was going into graveyards when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I lived in a
Mhm.
rural part of Connecticut, a very well to do city or town, a lot of woods and forests. And I had one really good friend, and we didn't really fit in the social hierarchy of middle school, which can be really
Right.
complicated. So we would just kind of spend a lot of time in the woods. And we also had Revolutionary War grave sites, cemeteries in our town dating
Mm.
back 300-400 years. And I loved going into those spaces and like hanging out with those people, like thinking about how is it that there's a body, or now probably not much left, but from
Mhm.
a totally different era in history, a history that I'm connected to through my own family lineage, but these are basically foreigners, strangers to me. And yet I can kind of hang out with them in this
Mm.
space. And that continued through college. There was a cemetery at our college campus that was a real sanctuary. It was a wooded glen, lots of old grave sites, and often we would trip and go into the graveyard because it was one of the quietest places on campus. I've talked to Buddhist people about this, and they said, "Oh, you're like a chud practitioner." And I was like, "What's that?" They're like, "Oh, the people
Mhm.
who hang out in graves in graveyards."
Oh, it's a thing?
Yeah, it's a thing.
And imagining you in the graveyard with just, like, the mycelium web underneath you,
And
the
that's
bodies and the
exactly.
mushrooms. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what's interesting is when I started exploring cemeteries, I really wasn't tuned into the mushroom world at all. I took mushrooms recreationally
Mhm.
for entertainment, like many of us do in our early 20s. And I was really unaware of where they came from, what they represented, that they were just this kind of little spark that comes out of this web of life. I did the learning kind of backwards.
There's a lot of talk about the use in the global north and our Western culture of the use of earth medicines and psychedelics for treating depression, anxiety, like pathologies. And yet 99% of the use of psychedelics is for exploration, recreation. I've interviewed a lot of people that will have these original recreational experiences that will end up recreational. It will gear their life in a certain direction. When you think back, even at that time in your early 20s of taking psilocybin, sitting in a graveyard, do you feel like even in the recreational realm, it had some impact?
It felt like the world turned on for the first time for me.
Mm.
It felt like I was living in a sterilized, prescribed simulation of what I
Mm.
was supposed to do with my life. And I had checked all the boxes. I had won the game. And
Mhm.
then I tried
At like
I
20.
know, right?
Done.
I know. And I encountered actually mushrooms and MDMA around the same time. And it felt
Mhm.
like a door opened into what the real world really was. And
Mm.
because I had been told the real world was something else, it felt very magical and supernatural. And I got really hooked on that kind of psychedelic honeymoon where you're like, I'm in on the secret. No one knows about this other
Mm.
world. It's from another planet. I'm from another planet. Like, how can this
Right.
be here right next to this other life that everyone else is telling me I'm supposed to be living? And then as the years went by, I realized that is the real world. And this,
Mm.
what we call the real world, is many degrees removed from what many of our human ancestors called the real world.
So go there a little bit because you were mentioning before we got on Hinduism and Buddhism, and when I asked you about death. So do you have a faith tradition, or has there been a ideology and philosophy and cosmology that has come out of the use of psychedelics?
Well, mushrooms gave me my own personal religion, so there's that. I grew
Mhm.
up Catholic, which isn't the best foundation for a cosmology, but it's a pretty good one. I mean, it's
Mhm.
quite mystical and magical if you get to the heart of it. And I haven't quite given up that. I think it just created a kind
Mhm.
of foundation of faith. And I remember in church trying to bring all of my attention to the altar, to the rituals, to this kind of horrific symbol of the crucifixion, expecting something magical to happen. I was like, this must be
Mm.
for a reason, right? Like, we're all
Mhm.
gathered here. This must do something.
Right.
And eventually, kind of leaving that space and going the other totally opposite end of the spectrum to atheism and scientific materialism, and
Mhm.
finding both sides really lacking.
Mm.
So then meditation offered me an internal way of navigating my own mind, the world. I explored Buddhism for a while, and I even found Buddhism kind of lacking. It was missing some kind of magical spark, which
Mm.
in traditional Tibetan Buddhism, there's a lot of magic. But the way it got translated into American culture is quite stripped away.
Yeah.
And so I kept searching and searching. And finally, when I ended up leaving my academic job, and we could talk more about that, but it was after the death of my sister, I took
Mm.
mushrooms in a religious framework for the first time. And
Wow.
that's finally when I encountered God, the
Mm.
divine, like something I had been searching for my whole life. And suddenly it was right there.
Wow. Okay, I don't know where to go. More into God or the death of your sister or leaving
I know.
research?
I like using all the taboo words:
Um,
death, God,
right,
it's fine.
exactly. So, first, before we get into this path and your sister, which we know led you to then being even more interested in death and this spirituality that came through the mushroom during that experience, let's go first to the reductionism and becoming a researcher and a scientist and what you learned there and the limits of that.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to remember, honestly. I
Mm.
think about it as like a past life. Like, I've already lived a few lives in this current incarnation, and so the materialist life was actually really fulfilling. It felt like it addressed a lot of my anxiety and fear about what was happening. I was like, "Oh, we can use science to understand what's happening." It is a nature-based religion in a way. No one was
Mhm.
talking about it that way to me, but it felt like a way of compartmentalizing the different things that happen. There's mind, brain, body, consciousness. Don't talk about spirit. I mean, even consciousness is
Right.
pushing the limit a little bit, but
Right.
I remember in college telling my dissertation advisor that I really wanted to take electrodes into the jungle and measure people's brains while they were taking ayahuasca. And this was before anyone was talking about this stuff. People were doing it,
Right.
a few people here and there, but I don't know where these ideas came from. But I thought, well, I'm really into drugs and I'm really into neuroscience. So it has to
Right.
be possible to combine these two. And then when I started grad school and I was a researcher on a very kind of groundbreaking study where we lived at a retreat center at 8,000 feet in Colorado alongside people who were meditating every day for 3 months. And at the
Wow,
time,
and where was that?
that was at Shambhala Mountain Center. It's a Tibetan Buddhist
Okay.
center. And we had a bunch of private funding. This was even before mindfulness was funded by the government agencies. We were one of the first 2 or 3 research labs dedicated to this kind of endeavor.
Put me on the map as far as what year we're in.
So I started grad school in 2004, and the
Mhm.
Shamatha project happened in 2006 and 7. And so this
Wow, and the
was
government at this point wasn't even funding meditation,
no,
mindfulness.
there were a
Interesting.
couple small studies, like John Kabat-Zinn had successfully
Yep, loved
convinced
him.
a medical
Mhm.
institution to incorporate mindfulness.
Mm,
But the idea of intensive meditation, that you could take Westerners who weren't monks and train them to become monks, was kind of a new idea outside of practitioners. It wasn't
mm,
accepted in science. The person who conceived of this whole idea was named Cliff Sarin, and he is like a mad scientist and one of the best people I've ever met. But it
aw,
came to him when he was visiting monks in India and trying to understand what made them special. Is it possible for each of us to become like that, or are they born like that? Is there something about the culture that makes them special? So he had the idea of training Westerners like their monks and seeing if you could capture some of the same types of outcomes. Do people get better at attending to boring things? Do people get better at regulating their emotions? What about
mhm,
compassion? How do you generate
right.
bodhicitta? Are these things within our grasp, or are they really a part of a culture that's separated from us? And so
And I can imagine that the answer is yes, it's within all of us.
it is. And I had a meditation teacher who said once, "Why are you studying mushrooms when we already have a method for enlightenment?" And I said, "Because the
Mm,
method is so hard and people don't want to do it." And so
mhm,
my view was always give people a taste of the finish line. Give them a taste of
mm,
where they're going so that then they can devote themselves to these harder practices. Like, why would you give up your whole life to meditate every day if it can
right.
take decades?
And it's interesting, I think they can run parallel, they're not different, or they don't need to be so separate. I've interviewed a lot of non-dual teachers and Buddhists, and I was interviewing a woman who she was studying to be a Buddhist nun, actually. And we were talking about how even in the history of Buddhism, when the monks were up in the Himalayas, there's talk about there being bufotamine, which is found in 5-MeO-DMT, but they didn't smoke it, that they actually were using it as incense.
Oh,
And I'm imagining if anybody who's listening has had the experience of 5-MeO-DMT, it's such an incredibly unitive experience and an experience of non-duality that maybe you've never experienced to that level.
yeah.
So it's interesting to me that he asked why psychedelics, because I believe that a lot of these faith traditions are born out of potentially an experience with an earth medicine of some kind.
I mean, it makes sense. And when I traveled to Nepal, this is what my friend told me. He said, first of all, the mushrooms grow here. Everyone knows it, but we don't take them. I said, okay, like take that note down. There's tons of cannabis. It's growing wild. It's everywhere. It's technically not legal or illegal. It's just kind of like wild.
Mhm,
And he showed me,
mhm,
mountainsides full of cannabis. So, with enough cannabis and some other things, that might be enough. And then I said, well, why don't you take the mushrooms? And he said, well, it's
mhm,
not part of our culture. And we grow up from the time we're babies, we know we're part of everything. We're not
mhm,
seeking to reconnect with everything. We're already connected. We're already together. We're completely dependent on each other. Our life continues after death. Like the things you guys are searching for through mushrooms, we already have it. And I thought that was
mm.
interesting. So I kind of took that
It
note
is
down.
interesting.
And what I will say about Buddhism, just like Christianity, is I think there was an original mystical seed. And
Mhm,
among the first practitioners, they were probably more free to explore all sorts of methods. And
mhm,
then as time goes on, a kind of orthodoxy gets established where you say, well, that one guy kind of went off the rails when he smoked too much cannabis. So we're going to include like no intoxicants. And that
right.
person was drunk all the time and he was a good meditator, but he was causing trouble and he wasn't doing his chores. So we'll say no alcohol. And you end
Mhm,
up with all these prescribed rules, just like any religion. And so when
Yeah.
you look at the end, you're like, well, what happened to that? What was happening in those early days? What was it
Right.
like for Jesus and Mary Magdalene? What was it like for the original people following the Buddha? Was it the Buddha? Was he just like a super strict dude? So he's like, get rid of all this crap. Like, I'm going to teach a new religion that's much more serious. I think the Hindus are actually more open to chemical or plant enhancement. And they have many, many gods, and their world is
Mhm.
very visionary. And Buddhism wanted to separate itself from Hinduism because the Buddha saw that no matter how he meditated, no matter how much he starved himself, no matter all of these practices he tried, he never could retain nirvana. And he wanted a method that would be indestructible. That no matter what you did, the method wouldn't go away. Like the ritual wasn't
Mhm.
needed. So when I was in Nepal, the closer we got to Tibet, we started meeting more shamanistic communities. And so I'll tell a brief story. There was an incident on our trip where a man died, a young man. And when we went to ask the villagers if they had seen anything or what they had witnessed, they had to sign like a witness testimony that this had happened, the death had happened, because we never found his body. And they said, well, we know why that happened. And we are like, well, tell us. And this is through my friend Prem, who was translating. And Prem said, oh, this is so superstitious. And I was like, tell me, I'm so curious. He said, well, when we entered this heavenly realm, it's called a Bayul. This area, this valley is divinely protected. And it's protected by certain spirits. And so there's a Naga, a serpent woman that lives in that river. What we should have done was sacrificed a chicken before we entered the Bayul, but we didn't make the sacrifice. And so she took him instead. And I was like,
What?
Lord. But for the people living there, this is this animism of everything and this idea that there's reciprocity. You don't just get to walk
Mhm.
into heaven, you have to give something up. And we didn't. We just pushed right through there with our egos and our American Buddhism. We didn't meet the people around us. We didn't even really
Didn't
listen. We
ask.
didn't even listen to the people guiding us through those spaces, many of
Right.
whom were Tibetan shamans. Well, not necessarily shamans in their culture, but shamanistic practitioners. And the tradition that they followed was the Bun tradition, which is an old, old form of Buddhism. And in
Yeah.
that form of Buddhism, you do eat meat, you do make sacrifices, you do burn sacred plants in ritual, and you do make offerings to spirits. And so it's so
Okay, for anybody on, like, the edge of their seat right now, was his body ever found?
no, and it became like a catalyst for me to continue to explore what I didn't know because I went to
Mm.
Nepal after my sister died seeking peace in my heart. I was like,
Yeah.
this is what I need to do. I'm going to honor her. I released her ashes at this beautiful nunnery. And then this young man dies in this really tragic way. And it's like he just disappeared. And I thought,
Mm.
okay, so death doesn't just happen in a hospital, it happens here at this river. It doesn't just happen to someone who knows they have cancer, it happens to someone who was vibrant and healthy and a great swimmer. And I had to really reorient my idea that I could avoid death by not doing X, Y, and Z. Like, and suddenly I saw, well, death happens in every way. It's all
Right.
over. You can't go to Nepal and avoid it. You can't live a happy life in America and make enough money and be really healthy and avoid it. Like, it's here. And so the death of this young man was actually harder for me in a way than my sister because I couldn't understand it. And I
Mhm.
wanted it to be fixed. I wanted to go back in time and fix that he had gone in the river. And he died in a heroic way. So our Buddhist teacher, who's very famous, went to the Dalai Lama and said, "Can you make a prayer for his soul?" And he said, "He's fine. He's already reincarnated. His family's fine," which wasn't even true. His family was really grieving. So I got to
Mhm.
see how even the Buddhists, they're not really following a correct understanding of death because the idea of reincarnation tries to erase grief. It says like, don't worry,
Mm.
you grieve for 49 days and then this guy's gone, he's fine, he's living his best life. And I got to see the family up close and I'm like, that mother is grieving the way my mother's grieving. This
Right.
loss is the
Right.
same. So I would say that my sister's death initiated me into this path, and the death of sitting inspired me to become an adult around death, that I couldn't just keep using these like childish ways of dealing with it.
So, in your sister's death and the death of this man, what have you come to believe about death, and how do you work with death?
Well, so this is where it gets really exciting. um, about 6 months after Tiding died, I went through, I mean, a horrendous winter of grief. So, coming
Okay.
up on the year anniversary of Rebecca's death, I was still very deep in grief about what happened in Nepal. I was caught in the, what did they call it? The bargaining, negotiating stage of like wanting to
Mhm.
somehow fix what had happened. Like I didn't want it to have happened.
Right.
And I met a woman on the trip who was a chaplain and this amazing mother of three kids who were a little bit older. They were younger than me, but she was a little bit older than me. So she's kind of like a mom figure.
Mhm.
And she and I had started talking about mushrooms. And I said, I'd really love to do a proper ceremony and I'd love for you to do it with me. And she was like, oh, I don't know. I'm kind of too old for that. I was like, oh, come on. Like, I joke in my book that I always convince someone to give it the real college try one more time.
Right.
Like, and then I came to meet this man who was a mushroom shaman. So we
Mhm.
organized this whole experience. And I describe it in detail in my book, and I don't want to there's some spoiler alerts, but what I encountered in that space, I saw my sister and sitting, and everyone who had ever existed was in this cosmic like map of the
Mhm.
universe. If you imagine like having your own star, like everyone had their place in this galaxy. And God was at the center, creating all of it, being with all of it. But there was no like separation of like, well, life is over here and death is over here. It was all
Mm-mm.
there. And that was my first understanding that my conception of what happens at death was just, I was not conceiving it correctly. I was seeing it as like a linear transition. And it gave me a lot of peace to know that in some way, all of those people had existed, continued to exist, and that I was part of that. And still, as I continued to have these more spiritual mushroom ceremonies, I started to inhabit that space instead of feeling like a tourist. Like I wasn't just visiting the God space, like I was part of it, and I had to get over myself as Catherine, as this person who'd done all these things in order to take my place in that matrix. And once I knew that I had a place in that matrix, I'm like, I can't be lost either. So, like, what am I afraid of?
It's such a profound place where, because you're really talking about, in some ways, the self dropping away, the identity. You just called yourself Catherine. It's the Catherine, in some ways, is falling away to enter a space that is, there is no death. In some ways, it's like there's death, there's life, there's no death, there's life. It's all of it all at once, everywhere,
Yes.
simultaneously. And not at all. I
Yes.
mean, coming to that place and being able to live from that place, I guess, is the continued practice of no practice.
Yeah.
You don't.
And I can also say that having those new foundational experiences in what felt like a new religion, but was not a
Mhm.
mushroom religion. It wasn't Buddhist, it wasn't Hindu, it wasn't Christian. It was like me. It was for me. Without that, I don't know how I would have given birth or been a mother or like gone through
Mm.
the things I've gone through. Like, I really have sympathy for people who don't have that faith because life is hard if you don't have that compass, if you don't have a center
Mm.
point. And that's why I tell people make the thing that works for you. And if another religion is out there and it's not working for you, it's got to be the thing that on your deathbed or when your child is
Mhm.
sick at night or when you don't know what to do financially, like that's the place you have to go to and know that no matter how life goes, you will return to this space at the end. If
Right.
you don't have that belief, like good luck. The only other people who I know are totally happy with death are the real atheists who are like, it's good, nothing happens. And I'm like, well,
Right. Right. I think for someone who hasn't experienced a psychedelic or an earth medicine or some kind of altered state of consciousness that potentially meditation can bring you into as well. But sometimes with the plant medicine, there is, as you said, you saw the world in a completely different way. It turned on a reality that is more primary to the reality that we all think is here. Can meditation do that? Sure, absolutely. What I've been thinking about recently, though, is because I'm a huge meditator, and I think at some point it's like, put down the phone, you don't need the medicine. There can be that way, or you can kind of look at it as something you're in relationship to when you need it. So when I think of psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, it feels like in some ways you're in a deep relationship with the consciousness and spirit of that plant too, or fungi. Because when you have an experience with fungi, it's showing you something. It's showing you almost its own cosmocracy. And then with ayahuasca, it shows you it differently.
Mhm.
And then with a molecule like LSD, it's like, whoa. So, in some ways, these medicines, when we are in relationship with them or consume them, it feels like it's almost a combination of human consciousness and plant consciousness or molecule consciousness that, in my own experience, has really expanded my ability to look at death differently, my own identity, the dropping away of self, anatta, the Buddhists would call it, the no self. And then you just said, like, you don't know how you could have done that and then experience the things you are as a mother. So let's move into motherhood because I wished that I had experienced these things younger because I feel like for my process, I started much later with earth medicines and psychedelics. Definitely followed the just say no to drugs thing. And I wish that I had done them before because not only beyond the spirituality of them and deeper understanding and knowing of self and understanding a different cosmocracy, I feel like before some of that comes or simultaneously, there's almost the deconstruction that's happening of your religious, familial, cultural identities and misunderstandings.
Mm,
And so I think as a mother, to do that before, in a way, you're not passing on some of that shadow,
yeah.
conditioning, ideologies. So I'd love to switch to how psychedelics have impacted you as a mother from birth to now.
Yeah. Well, both my children were conceived with the help of mushrooms, so I'll just put that out there. The two of the three religious experiences I had with mushrooms were followed within the next month by conception. So my daughter was conceived within about 3 weeks after not the first mushroom experience, but the one that followed later that year. It felt like the first one kind of showed me the terrain and
Mhm.
God was like, "Hi, I'm here. Everything's cool. Like, are you gonna like start walking this new path now? Please? Like, we've been waiting for you. Like, come on."
Mhm.
It felt almost like a cosmic joke. Yes, we finally
Right.
got her. We have her attention. The mushroom experience that followed that first one, I mean, it was so fast that the mushrooms gave me my next mission. And I talk about the mushrooms as like being really excited for human potential. They're not so
Mm.
excited about, like I don't think they really care if we are healthy or, like, what we do for a job. They are just like, "Are you happy? Like, what are you here to do? What can you do that no one else can do?" And so I was really surprised when they're like, "You're gonna be a mom." And I was like, "Really? But I'm really good at traveling. I like to have a lot of fun."
Science.
Like, science, yeah. I mean, the science thing almost like they were like, "Oh,
Mhm.
we're gonna move past that one quickly." So I was surprised at how quickly I embraced that new reality of I'm here to be of service, to give birth, to help create something that has never been created before. And my daughter, I don't know if it's because of her or the mushrooms or what, but she spoke to me from the womb. It felt like I
Mm.
finally had life force in me. And just being with
I
her,
mean, if that's not magic, come on.
I know.
Like the woman's body basically takes nothingness and creates something. Like,
Yeah.
that's so
It
magical.
felt
It
like
takes the formless and puts it in form.
exactly, it felt like her energy came shooting across the galaxy and landed in my womb,
Right.
and then just lit a fire. And when she finally came out of me, it was very disorienting that she had a form because I had been
Mhm.
communicating with this energy for 9 months, 10 months, and she already had a whole personality, she had an identity, I knew exactly who she was, and then suddenly she's this, like, weird baby thing that needs to eat
Being.
all the time. And like, I could,
Needs a diaper changed.
it's like for those first 12, 14 months, I could never get a break. So that was my
Yeah.
trial by fire. I did not have a baby that slept through the night ever. She still sleeps with me in bed. She's 9 years old. I took her everywhere with me because I didn't want to stop working and meeting people and
Mhm.
traveling. So she traveled all over the world. She still does. She's traveled to like 8 or 9 countries in 9 years.
Wow.
And she's just as mystical and magical as she was when I first met her in that energy
Mm.
form. And I just watch her trying to become a human, which I know is the hard part. So it's the beauty, but also the pain of knowing like she has to walk this same path of self discovery,
Mhm.
hopefully with a better foundation, with a mom who feels really happy in her own skin, has not shied away from addressing what happened to her as a child and as a young
Mhm.
adult, and isn't
Mhm.
afraid of death. So I remember actually it was my daughter who I was talking to my mom about how death is really scary. And she kind of overheard us. She's like, "You're wrong. Death is not scary at all. It's beautiful." And she doesn't
Mm.
remember telling me this. She was about 3 years old, but she used to talk about things that she couldn't really know on this plane. Like she would talk
Mhm.
about her life that she had before, where she was before she got to my womb. She told me she met my sister who had died. And
Wow.
it's like there was that window in the first 3 or 4 years where she still really had access to that. And then I don't know if it's our culture, but I feel like people fully land here and then
Mhm.
have to adapt to the conditions of Earth. And then if you're lucky, you get a chance, like as you go to reconnect with what you came here with.
Yeah, to remember.
There's a little thing I wanted to kind of add about the mushroom
Mhm.
experience because the first experience, because people sometimes listen and they're like, oh, that sounds like perfect. Why wouldn't everyone want to do that? But it was hard.
Yeah. It's so hard. I remember saying to one of my daughters when she was, like, really questioning my journey, and I was like and maybe it's because when I had come back from journeys or whatever, I'd be like, "Oh my god, it's so beautiful." Because yes, there was always beauty, and I think that return to self, return to a knowing is so beautiful. But I was like, "This has been probably the hardest path that I could have possibly taken," because no one's going down this path without encountering the shadow.
Mhm.
First, the individual and childhood experiences that were painful and repressed and not able to be understood. And after there's the individual, it's like the collective. You're really tapping into the collective experiences of helplessness as human beings, of helplessness and shame and am I worthy? All those deep wounds first the individual kind of has, which I didn't even know I had. I was like, shadow? What shadow? I'm always really happy. So I think that's an interesting piece that you're about to touch on, that this mushroom experience isn't always just show me everything everywhere all at once and meeting God.
Yeah. The way I experienced it early on, it's like there was a balance. Like I felt like I was entering a realm that for me felt like the underworld. It felt
Mhm.
like the space of death. It felt like the space of suffering. And that I
Mhm.
had to walk through that world to be granted access to this bigger space. It took a while for me to identify that that was mostly trauma. And I know trauma
Mhm.
gets overused as a word now, but it felt like a real landscape to me. And it was a part of my consciousness. It was my mind that I had to walk through in
Mhm.
order to get to other parts of my mind that were interconnected with this greater space. There was a period of many years where every time I took mushrooms, I felt like I was going to die. I felt scared. I mean, like really panic level, like paranoia. And I was like, man, why am I doing this still? But with,
It's so funny you say that. I've said to a friend the other day, like, every now and then someone will say, "You wanna do mushrooms?" I'm like, "No." And so I'm like, "No." And I was thinking of that. I was really curious about my internal healer that must have come on because every journey was hard. And then even in taking them myself and just taking a little, I'd be like, "I'll just stick my toe into whatever this is trying to bring me to." I'm not liking it, but something within me kept going back to this very dark place.
yeah,
And you're right. I do feel the same way that it was through that There was some access given to a different opening of a deeper part of myself.
Yeah, that's it. And I can't separate my experience from having grown up in the Catholic Church. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of metaphors in Christianity about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And like, you
Mhm.
know,
Dark night of the soul. I'm like,
perhaps,
does it end?
yeah, it's like perhaps that doesn't happen for everyone, but
Yeah.
even those people who don't grow up with that religion, it so permeates our culture, whether we
Mhm.
like it or not, that we have to accept those metaphors and know that our brain has been linking up with those metaphors since we first started going to school, first started going to church, going to family, Thanksgiving or Christmas if you're Christian.
Totally.
And maybe each religion has its own kind of underworld, but mine in
Mhm.
particular was really nasty and scary. It became easier in the mushroom ceremony with a shaman because I knew that he was tending the fire, he was tending the
Mhm.
space, and that I really trusted that he would not allow me to harm myself. And my
Mhm.
friend was there, and I really knew that even if he screwed up, she was going to make sure I didn't hurt myself. And
Yeah.
out of this horrendous experience, even when I thought it was done, I thought the experience was done. And then he said, we really need to thank the altar. And now that's thanking the mushrooms, but also thanking that space. Now, I didn't know what the space was. So I was like, what does he mean? Thank the altar.
Mm.
And then I remember kneeling down and looking, and suddenly it's like, it like just opened up. And I couldn't understand how I had just walked through this brutal experience and then suddenly was at the feet of God. I feel like the mushrooms too, they know what kind of opera you want. They know what kind
They
of theater you want. So if like that was the
Mhm.
theater I needed to be surprised, blown away, laughing, so thankful, but someone else may need a different opera. It needs to go a different
Right.
way.
Yeah, or different times, different ones, whether it's like the Buddha showing up or the blue goddesses of Hinduism
Right.
or just the galaxy or this feeling of mother.
And I have
Yeah.
to also, I always forget to mention this part. So because I had already sat for hundreds of sessions at Hopkins, I
Mhm.
knew the path always comes around. We
Always.
never saw someone lost on the path. They might have had a hard time, they might have almost gone astray. And I
Right.
really had to trust my teacher, who was Bill Richards, Mary
Mhm.
Casamano, who's just like the embodiment of unconditional love,
Yeah.
and watch that they navigated through that path with so many people that they had a faith that it would always come around to this glorious end.
Well, you're bringing up a really good point because you were in incredible hands, and I was lucky enough to be in incredible hands too. Even when I said when I took it on my own, I had been working for years with incredible people in the United States that are well respected and known. I think that's really important because I think you can do them on your own and maybe you do get stuck. I think some people
Right.
do get stuck. I think some people get really stuck in the trauma looping without support of doing parts work or internal family systems or somatic work or having meditation practice. I think that all the things that we are trying to talk about in the psychedelic space as supports to this, even more so. I just came back from a conference and I was thinking this morning of Dr. Gul Dolan. I interviewed her and I ran into her. Her work has really, really impacted me many times to just reflect on it. And basically, it's just the critical period that after an earth medicine or psychedelic, we really go into child mind, that our neurology is new. As Michael Pollan talked about, the new snow is put down. But if you come into a place that isn't, let's say, safe for you, or you're going back to work and work is actually an environment that reprises some trauma of childhood because of some relationship with somebody there. So I do think that more and more, it's so essential after these journeys. We might need like critical period retreats
Yes.
where you don't come right back into life. You don't come back because we were so lucky to be held in a place where that turnaround was a guarantee in that kind of holding and safety. Ibogaine, Iboga is like a month critical period being open.
Which is such a good point because I don't like to invoke iboga casually. So I'm
Mm,
just going to say
I
this
don't
super
either.
briefly. I felt a really strong calling to it for a really long time. And I
Yeah.
was very close to actually going. And then I
Mhm.
talked to a woman I had met who was a survivor of major trauma. And she said,
Mhm.
"You might not be able to get out of bed for 2 weeks. How are you going to take care of your kids? Like, how are you going to go to work?" I was like, "No, I've done this before. I know the drill." And she
Mm-mm.
goes, "You don't understand.
Mm-mm.
It was like a month before I could make a phone call." And I
Yeah.
thought, you know what? I have busted through spaces where I was a little
Mhm.
bit beyond where I could manage at the time, and I
Mhm.
don't need to do it this way. Like I
No.
and I feel like that's more than anything, that's what the mushrooms gave me was they worked so well and then they kind of stopped working. I felt betrayed, but I feel like they were also trying to show me like, look, you don't have to do it this way. You can do it a
Mhm.
softer way. You can take care of yourself. You may never have to take 15 grams. Just because someone said they
Exactly.
are curious what happens if you do it, 5 grams was enough. And now, like 200
Mhm.
milligrams is enough. I
Mhm.
can take a microdose with intention, and the mushrooms are like, hey, remember that awesome trip we did like 10 years ago? That was super fun, but now we're doing life. I can get kind of militant about the right support for people. And at the
Mm.
same time, I really trust that people, once they hear this message, they know how
Yes.
to take care of themselves. And
Exactly.
what I think we don't have right now is a good way for helping people grieve the possibility that it may not be the right time and place for them to have this experience. Like
Mhm.
everyone wants this, and I get it. If I could give this to everyone, I would. But
Mhm.
they didn't have to live with me for the 6 months in between those 2 mushroom sessions where I
Mm.
was doing a lot of somatic therapy and I was crying
Mm.
every day and feeling like I was hungover but not drinking, and, like, that part, nobody wants that part. That part sounds hard. It's like, yeah, but it
It's nobody even really talks about it.
at Hopkins,
If
we
I
never did. We didn't tell people you might feel great and also terrible for 6 months.
Yeah, you might actually go into a dark night.
Yeah.
And by the way, also with these medicines, so beyond the child work and the energetics and resetting, we always talk about these resets. Well, it's not a button. It's not like you have been reset. This reset takes somatic inquiry and somatic experiencing and massage and to take care of the system and all these things that like we don't really talk about. It's like, oh, psychedelics do a reset. Oh, that sounds magical.
No, what they do is that they slowly show you in tiny steps the changes that
Mhm.
they would encourage you to make to get to
Mhm.
a point where you wake up in the morning and life is not any easier, but you're just inexplicably content. What
Mm.
is that? You can't jump to that point. And
No.
meditation can get you there, it's true, but
Mhm.
I mean, my husband is the only person I know who meditates every morning. I don't know how he does it. And he's just like, "This is just my thing. I need this to get through the rest of my day. This is my medicine."
I'm like that.
I do know that meditating every day works, but if I can
Mhm.
only think of one person who's really serious about this practice who can do it, and I know a couple others who don't have kids and do it, but,
Yeah,
it's
that's
really,
true.
various paths work, and I it feels like for me, it's like I started with the big fireworks and the
Mhm.
explosions, and now it's like I get a massage once a month. I sleep like 8 or 9 hours a night. I just bought a an incline for my bed so it reduces a lot of the stress on your body overnight. Like I'm all about dialing in my sleep and like
Mhm.
baths, and I used to do acupuncture and the somatic therapy. Like I'm like, how can I better take care of this vessel so that I can continue this happiness? I no longer
And
feel called to do 5 grams.
no. Yeah, I'm not in that space either, but will I be someday again? I don't
I
know.
know.
Whew, and I did do a boga, so and I
Oh,
know what that journey is like and how long. I always say I'll probably be integrating that forever.
yeah.
I like highlighting these things. I'm grateful that you're highlighting the fact that there's a piece of this that people don't really dive into. Like if I pulled out my journals from that period of time where I was doing that deeper work, there's volumes.
Yeah.
Speaking of journals, you have written a memoir.
I journaled a lot while I was having these experiences, and after about 8 years of
Mhm.
religiously remembering, writing down, processing, doing all of the different work. COVID is what gave me the opportunity to finally write it in a way that
Mm.
was digestible by others.
Yeah.
And I think that many creatives experienced that the pandemic was horrific and it's still ongoing. And yet it was the thing that caused everything to pause just long enough to be like, if I die in a year, I have done
Mhm.
this. I have left my mark. I have created something that outlasts
Right.
me. If I never, I know. And
Congratulations.
if I never, I have so many more things I want to create. But if I, this was the book that I needed to write to die a happy person. That feels
Oh,
quite grandiose, but
yeah.
it's like, this is the story that I needed out of me and in the
Mhm.
world so that I didn't take it with me.
That's been percolating recently. I'm like, the Psychedelic Mom book. What is that story? It's a wild story. My producer is always like, "The stories and stuff not even on your podcast." I'm like, "I know."
Yeah.
So, I know in my own process, death is many things. Like, we were just talking about through psychedelics, I feel like so many parts of myself have died. Like, when you were saying earlier, when you were doing the science and research, you're like, "Oh my gosh, that feels like a person ago." I feel the same way, like, there's aspects that I'm like, "Who is that?" It's almost like that memory is like, "Huh, wow, who is she? Does she exist anymore?" And so, there's death in life already, but let's, yeah, shift back to this conversation about death.
Well, so for me, the beginning and the ending were kind of linked. When my sister died, that was the beginning of my rebirth, my new life.
Mm,
And then when my father died, that was the beginning of another new life. I just see the potential in death to give birth to something new. Both of them had a beautiful death. My sister's was tragic, too early, unwanted, painful. The space wasn't right, all of that. And still, it was
mm,
beautiful. And what she gave to me as she was dying was this just eternal optimism that, like, everything is going to be fine. And in fact, it's going to be fantastic. And then with my dad's death, he was the real, I call him the monster in my life in my book, but
mm,
now even though it's only been a year, I'm like, I wish I didn't say it that extremely because he's now
mm.
such a benefactor and a guru to me. I think in death, you can see relationships differently. And I saw that
Uh,
my dad was not who he was in life. He was something so much grander than that. And that maybe he had been dealt a kind of hard role. If you think about life as a theater, like the opera that these mushrooms want us to understand, my dad had to play the villain in a way.
I've been thinking a lot recently about splits. You know, a person can be so amazing, and we all at our core are this sacred being. And yet, as you just said, maybe your father had experiences that then he became the monster. It's a split. It's like another part takes over. I view it as a part got the best of that person
That's
in
it.
ways.
No, that's it. And I was having this conversation with my husband recently where I said the person I was in my 20s
Mhm.
flirted with that instability and psychosis that runs in my family. And if that part of me had dominated, it would have caused a lot of harm to a lot of people. At this point, if that person had heard that in their 20s, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm not the problem,
Totally.
you know?
Everybody else is.
And it's hard to even hear that you're the problem when you haven't come to accept that part of yourself yet. So, like, now it's
Right.
like, I love that Catherine, and she causes a lot of trouble. So, like, she gets to hang out, but she doesn't get to run the
Mhm.
show.
Exactly.
And I keep learning about these other bit players who are causing
Mhm.
trouble and trying to like mess stuff up. My son is like the embodiment of so many of the like classic troublemakers in history. And I'm
Mhm.
just trying to teach him that, like, that's all you and it's great. And also, they can't run the show because when they run the show, things really get out of whack. And
Right.
so, in a way, it's like, yes, the death, but also the integration of all of those
Totally.
parts of myself.
It's kind of fun to learn about
It's
them and
amazing.
see them. You're
It's
like,
like
"Oh, look at
I'm
you."
actually listening to a memoir by a woman with schizophrenia
Oh,
who's
wow.
also extraordinarily talented and intelligent, so she can write about it.
Mhm.
But she couldn't just, like, kick out the schizophrenic woman. She really had
Mhm.
to understand what she needed, but then also not deny her own, like, sane part of herself the life that she wanted.
Right.
that she couldn't just gut it out and never get married, never have kids, live a solitary life. She's like, no, the other part of me wants this normal life. And the
I
schizophrenic
think
part
this is
has demands. So, like, what are we going to do here?
what you're talking about to me is literally the most incredible path. This is some of my favorite work with clients, like, just allowing all the parts in the space and then being able to, as the adult in the room, or coming from that, I call it your true nature, that no self part, I think, really allowing that part to be in dialogue with all these parts to say, like, you don't get to run the show, but I see you and I love you. And God, you're fun
I know.
sometimes.
And I think about, like I was saying earlier, about my daughter and who she was before she came here. And
Mhm.
I like to get to know that part of myself more and more. And
The
I actually
primordial.
think that's the part we reconnect with when we die. Like, it may
Totally.
actually be
It's always
not
here.
totally accessible when we're in a body. And it felt to me like when my dad died, it was this amazing reunion for him with that part of himself that had been hidden his whole life.
Totally.
And I don't know, it could just be my imagination making like a really nice end to his story, but I felt it, and I felt him telling me, like, in so many cosmically funny ways,
Mhm.
it's fantastic here. Thank you for being with me through that hard stuff so that I could have this opportunity to remember at the end. Now I'm just like
Yeah,
cruising through the cosmos.
I know. I was with a woman this weekend and she's like, "What are you talking about? Like what you do with clients?" And I was like, "Well, kind of breaks the brain." She's like what?" And I said, "Okay, I'll just ask you a couple questions and see where you go. Without any thought, where's the past? Without any thought, where's the future? Without any thought, who are you? Without referencing any thought, what is this?" And it's interesting 'cause she was like, "Okay, my mind never stops.
Yeah.
It just kept bringing me to this." And sometimes when I think of that part of ourselves, that primordial part of ourselves that's always there, that's always in the space, that is always quiet, that is always like, wow, life is wild, whether it's brutally hard or amazing. Being in this space as much as we can of that and allowing that part of ourselves to dialogue with these parts.
And I love that too, because if people, as people are getting closer to death, they are doing that experiment you just asked, whether they
Mhm.
know it or not. And since they haven't had practice, they panic, they get agitation. The picture of death at the end of life with all of the psychiatric medications and the morphine and everything, it's because people aren't practiced in those questions.
Mm.
So I ask people too to think about death happening tomorrow, a week from today, a month, a year, and find the timeline that feels grabbable right now, like you can grasp it. And then you work closer and closer until it's
Mhm.
like, what if death was the next breath? Because then at least they've had practice. And I have
Right.
to believe that that reduces agitation at the end. You won't need people restraining you to keep you in bed. You won't be like flailing around, like, what am I seeing? What is happening? It's like, oh, I've done this before. Like, this is
Mhm.
new, but I've also done it a million times.
Do you view it as, like, when we're asleep at night, we wake up, right? And that this is a bit of a wake life dream.
Yes. I gotta
And
tell you, I have this sneaking suspicion, and I know people have talked about this in like a Reddit forums and stuff. Like, what if at death you wake up and you're like in a ceremony and you're just like waking up out of the ceremony and you've got all new friends and they're like, "How was the
totally, you're
trip?"
like, "Oh my god, that was wild. What just happened?"
I mean, I hope I don't wake up into like what turned out to be a lifelong psychedelic trip. Like, that would be kind of funny and also like, oh god, I got to do it again. But um well, so
Yeah.
mushrooms and 5-MeO showed me that other
Mhm,
side. And
mhm,
it was not like waking up into a ceremony, but it was like
mhm.
all the language doesn't really work. It felt like suddenly
Exactly.
I was as big as the whole universe. And that
Mhm.
this idea of history, of the world, of me, of biographies, of writing, of science, that was the figment and
Mhm.
that what was real was so huge.
Fast.
And I was like, oh, I one of the last thoughts I had on 5-MeO was that history is just a totally fabricated construct. It doesn't exist
Totally.
anywhere. But then,
Mm-mm.
you say that as the world is turning and things are happening and people are like, God, shut up with your like
Totally.
solipsism, it's like
Totally. Exactly.
so
Exactly.
that I
Like,
think this is
I'm going to the kitchen to make dinner. If you wanna sit there and tell me that there's no dinner and there's no one making dinner, it is hard to imagine that these things coexist simultaneously.
right. And I feel like this is maybe where Buddhism got it right because
Yeah.
they knew that people would have this nirvana experience and assume that that was equally real. And then they're
Mhm.
like, okay, now that you've had this experience, you're going to come home and you're going to wash the dishes and you're going to take care of your kids and you're going to
Chop
do
wood.
the same thing, knowing that this is not different than that. And so, like the form and the formless, there's no different.
No
When I
difference.
first heard that, I was like, oh, I don't even know where to start. And now I feel like I know where to start.
Yeah, I thought it was Chinese. Like, I just thought it was a different language. Like, no self what?
Yeah,
Like, the form is the formless? What? Like, what? Science helps us with that
of
too.
course.
We know that this table right in front of me is just vibrating empty space in a way,
It sounds
you
equally
know?
preposterous.
It sounds preposterous, but science would tell us that that is true. So how do you prepare and work with people around death? And when you think of your own death, how would you envision it?
Well, I'm looking out right now at the land where I plan to die if I'm lucky enough to be here and that my body can be here. In a way, I am creating my favorite cemetery. And it's full of trees and it's full of kids and it's joyful and it's playful and it's wide open and there's a lot of sun. And I have a great partner who's really amazing at picking the right plot of land. I wouldn't know that
Mm.
you're supposed to like be south facing because then in the winter you feel like you're not going to like just hibernate the whole time. I feel like I'm seeing the final visions of my life every day and getting more and
Mhm.
more happy about that. And I would love to be traveling through my afterlife moments in fire. If it's open air
Mm.
cremation, I would feel like that final moment. I'm just like, yes, I fucking did it. I don't know why that's like a thing. I feel like it challenges a lot of American sensibilities about like how
Yeah, say it again, because I think if someone heard it, they were like, "Wait, what? What does she want?"
open
Explain it.
open air cremation is one of the oldest forms of dealing with a dead body, but it's an open pyre. It's like a bonfire. The person is dead. We're not burning people alive here. This is just it's after death, usually wrapped in a shroud, and there's a very high heat bonfire that burns. It could be up to 24 hours, but usually less, until all that's left are bone fragments and everything else has been burned away and returned to the world. This is practiced in Hindu cultures, Buddhist cultures, I'm sure cultures that we don't have a memory of or name of anymore because we've obliterated them. And
Well, it's interesting too because I don't know the percentage of people cremated, but all you're really talking about is a natural version of cremation.
exactly. And the thing that I learned recently from this woman, Caitlin Dowdy, who's a mortician and a really cool social media death person,
Mhm.
but she visited this place in Crestone, Colorado. And while she was there, she was talking to the folks who ran the pyre. And she said,
Mhm.
well, how does this relate to industrial cremation? And they said, well, actually, industrial cremation can be viewed as dangerous spiritually because you're
Mm.
trapping the soul in a box. You're still
Mhm.
enclosing the energy, it can't fully return. Now,
Right.
that's someone's belief system. My dad was cremated in a box like that, and I didn't feel like he was restrained at all. Like he just blew through that whole cement
Right.
structure almost immediately. So I think that death by fire works no matter how you do it. I think death through natural decomposition works. The one death I don't think, or the one death care thing that I don't think works is embalming and burying in a coffin. I feel sad. My dog agrees. He just growled when I said
Like,
that.
"Oh, that sounds
My little
miserable."
puppy. This is like a little factoid. I'll just mention it.
Mhm.
Embalming was only conceived because of the Civil War. So we needed a way
Mm.
to bring all of these young men's bodies back to their home for proper funeral rites. And everyone was decomposing. So they had to get them on a train and get them back thousands of miles. People were inundated with death. So suddenly the modern funeral industry was created. We're going to pump them full of chemicals. We're going to make sure that they look like they were alive because nobody wants to know that they actually died in war. We want to be able to do the Christian burial rites. They need to go in a
Mhm.
ground, in a coffin with a headstone. So suddenly we have this really removed way of dealing with death.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
continued. Apparently, the American funeral industry, this room that I'm in right now is called a living room. Do you know what it used
Mhm.
to be called? A death room, like the parlor. This was where the wake happened. This is where the body was held.
Right, in your
And they
home.
rebranded it.
Yeah.
Now it's a living
Living
room.
room.
Like death is not happening here. And my dad died at home, and I really had to hold
Mhm.
off the death care system, even just 24 hours to be with his body because they want to pick up the body. It can only be the funeral director. The hospice people don't want to touch, as soon as the body's dead, they can't touch the body. They can't even help you move the body. And I'm like, what is
Really?
with all
What?
these rules? It's a way of commodifying death that I don't
Totally.
think most funeral
No.
directors would be on board with if they really thought about like how it's
Mm.
keeping the family away from that intimate
Right.
experience. But I'm like kind of fascinated by all these like rules that we've created around like who's allowed to touch a dead body, where it can be moved, how
Totally.
it can be
I've
disposed
said
of.
for years I was Catholic too, and I'm like, "Okay, no wake, no this," like, just thinking about what I want, and I
Yeah.
had mentioned to you, the mycelium casket
I
that my
love
mother and
that.
I were deciding to I had made mycelium things. So myceliums is, as everybody who's listening might know, is the what's under the ground from the fungi. It will grow in any shape until you heat it, and then it stops growing. So you can make a planter, you can make a chair. There's an incredible artist that's making these beautiful chairs with them. But I saw where they were making some caskets. So my mother and I were brainstorming, which I was shocked that she was like, "Oh, I want to do that." She was like, "How about the shape of an egg or a uterus or something?" It had like a moss place where you'd sit. And basically, the body decomposes in, I think it's 40 days.
Yeah, it's
You are
fast.
soil. So I was like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put seeds on the top. So then when we decompose, like you get to choose what flowers get to emerge from your death.
I love it.
Like, what? That's how we should
I know.
die.
I have a friend who's going to be buried or have her ashes added to like a redwood grove.
Okay.
I know this amazing woman out on the West Coast. She created this
Hmm.
recompose process, which happens on
Hmm.
farms all the times with farm animals. They just get added to a compost pile and create
Right.
soil. So, urban death centers where your body can move through all the layers of soil until you grow trees in the park. And like her
I mean,
whole,
it seems like common sense.
yeah. She's
The
like,
whole
you
death
could be
industry needs
a
to
lemon.
change.
You could make
Right,
lemonade out of
right.
your body. And like, I saw at a Bread and Puppet Theater, which is like a really weird far left progressive outdoor theater thing in northern Vermont. They had little fairy huts for each person who had died that was part of the community. I don't know if their bones were in there or an
Hmm,
urn, but it was like each person, as you walked through the forest, you could visit their little part of the forest, their little fairy house. That sounds super cool. Natural burial sounds awesome. Very hard to do in Vermont because there are so many rocks, So we got to be kind of
right.
creative. But I love these questions. It's like meeting people, learning what they care about,
Mhm.
really asking them to envision what kind of way do you want to die and be cared for so that your family has really positive, beautiful memories around it that they may be then inspired to do really amazing things with their life. And with my sister, thank God she showed me the beauty in her hospital room because the way that it happened after that, it could have destroyed me. And I promised myself my dad was the next one to come after her that I was personally responsible for, and I like fought tooth and nail to give him these beautiful rituals and this amazing
Mm,
send off. I was there when he was cremated, and the funeral director said, A, no one in Connecticut has ever asked to keep the body, and B,
mhm.
no one ever asked to come to the crematory. He said, I couldn't even challenge myself to be in the room when it started. He said, so you've done something really
Interesting.
unusual for your dad that I think is going to stay with you.
Right.
Um, so thank God I'm one of those weirdos that can, be in these spaces with people. It really
Or
brings me joy.
or really being in the process of having the conversations about changing the way we die in the death
Yeah.
process in the United States. I think it's a really important conversation.
And of course, psychedelics help because what other than psychedelics can help us envision death in this way? I mean,
No?
maybe it comes to some people naturally, but I think my own experiences with psychedelics, which I hope to put in my next book, which is more about fire. The first book was about water, and the second book is
Ooh,
about fire. But I have really specific, crazy, hilarious psychedelic stories that showed me that fire was this path for me. Anyway, so I won't
love it.
I won't spoil those.
I love it. When you were working at Johns Hopkins, were you doing any of the work with people that had cancer and they were using psilocybin for people that were afraid of death?
So it's funny. Everyone always asks me because it's like
Mhm.
obvious. Why would she not have been doing that work
Mhm.
then? I was such a newbie. I was like a child. I was 29 when I got there. And so they gave me not full reign, but they really set me into the study for what's called healthy normals. I love this scientific term, healthy normals. It's like none of us are that. Bill Richards and Mary, with all of their experience and their seniority, would be better poised to navigate the death and end of life space with cancer patients, and which was probably
Mhm.
true. Bill's whole thing was that there is a noetic quality to psilocybin, especially that anyone who encounters it will remember the meaning of life, like why we're here, all of that. So he was like our resident religious professional, and Mary was our,
Mhm.
resident loving mother figure. And I did see those people come and go from the research lab, and I met a few of them. And I think that psilocybin is really helpful for people who know that they want to have that experience before they die,
Mhm.
and is much less helpful for people who are prescribed that experience because they're terminally ill. And it's kind of like
Mm.
anything. It's like if you went to your doctor, said, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I don't know what to do with this stage 3 diagnosis. And they're like, well, we have this new medicine that you can sign up for. I don't know how that goes. Whereas the people
Right.
coming to us were so self selected and they knew that's
Mm.
what they wanted, even if they hadn't had a lot of experience before, that it's more about a calling to a
Mhm.
way of being in the world that I don't know, is it 10, 15% of people? That would be my guess. So again, I hope that this option is available and if people get educated that they can choose it, but like try it well before you have a terminal illness. Don't wait. If
Can't
you
wait.
think this is on your wish
Bucket
list,
list?
yeah, don't
Go.
wait, because what
No.
if it tells you something that could change the path of getting a terminal illness? What if it changes
Right.
everything?
Relationships.
Yeah.
There's a woman I interviewed, Queely Powers, and she serves 5-MeO-DMT toward end of life. She's a Buddhist as well. It's fascinating. But yeah, if you have the calling, go where it's legal, find a place, find somebody really good to do it with because it can change your life. Yeah, and motherhood, right?
I know there's so much more to say about motherhood.
I
I
know.
joke that so the second book is more about death. I know, yeah, the first book is about death, but the second one even more so. The third one is about motherhood, but I gotta wait for that one. I don't even know what to
Yeah.
write yet. I just need to keep
Yeah,
living it until I can even say
exactly.
like 10 words about it. It's like-
Exactly. Because again, I look back at the stages of motherhood. I'm in a completely different stage now, navigating much trickier waters actually that I'm still figuring out as my kids have gotten older. So I'll have you back.
Yeah. It'll be a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll talk motherhood. Yeah. Anything else you would want someone who's listening to know or how to find you and anything about your work?
Yeah. So the book is called Midnight Water, a psychedelic memoir. It was out in the world through all of the normal channels for a year. And then I felt like it really wanted to be back with me on my land at the being ground. So
Mhm.
I got all the copies back here and
Yeah.
they're for sale on my website, but I also give away copies and I give an
Mhm.
option for people to write to me directly if they have a specific need or desire to bring it into the world. So that feels really great. The audiobook and the ebook are still available through Kindle and Audible. and I'm really proud of the audiobook. It's 12 and a
I
half
love
it's
audios.
12 and a half hours, so it's like an acid trip.
Yeah.
It's like, don't get into it and then stop, just like start all the way through to the
Go.
end. My website is my name, katherinemaclean.org. It's pretty simple, but there's a lot of resources there. And I update
Mhm.
things, occasionally add new things that I'm doing. But more and more, I keep getting pulled into this local lifestyle with my kids in school. I taught math
Mhm.
at the local middle high school. Wasn't my cup of tea, but man, did I learn a whole lot about teenagers in a single year. So I keep asking life, like, what's my next mission? What am I here to do?
Right.
And just
These
being
are the life
open.
psychedelics. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here
Thank
and
you.
sharing everything that you're doing, and now this new phase of life where you're in life. Life itself is the
Life
psychedelic,
is
right? It's
lifing
like
me.
exactly, exactly.